Hi everyone, welcome back to Rolling Through Negotiations. Guess what? This episode now is episode 90. We're definitely firing up on these episodes and we're recording this one in July 2025. I'm Matthew Karakalakis. I'm the host of Rolling Through Negotiations. I work in commercial law and dispute resolution, and I'm also a mediator. I've been a lawyer negotiating legal matters for more than 20 years. But what it means is I know firsthand what it's like to navigate high-pressure negotiations, and that's exactly what we explore here on this podcast. So, if this is your first time listening, I really do hope you find something useful in this episode, because that way you're going to learn, you're going to grow. I also want to give you a high five if you're a returning listener, because if you have come back, you listen to the podcast regularly, you're a legend and love having you here. So this week we have an amazing guest. We have a good friend, brother boy, Marius Little. Marius Little is from MTL Consulting, and he does a lot of work in terms of Aboriginal business, Aboriginal organisational engagement, closing the gap. And the stuff that Marius speaks about is very relevant given we're currently in NAIDOC week. We speak about ACOs, Aboriginal community controlled organisations, and the kinds of negotiations that can take place with statutory authorities, with government organisations. What are some of the challenges that come up when you're negotiating with government? Marius shares this, plus much more. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. Before we get into it, let's acknowledge the traditional custodians of these lands. Let's pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the Kaurna peoples whose land we're recording this episode from. Without further ado, let's go episode 90 with Marius Little. Us. All right, Marius, I've been looking forward to this yarn with you for a while, right? And one of the amazing things I want to speak with you about, and I think our listeners are going to love hearing, is this whole principle of co-design and the way that co-design positively impacts negotiations.
Thanks, Matty. Look, you're right. It has been a long time coming, this conversation. We've talked about having it for a while now, so great to be here. Thanks for having me. Co-design is certainly a hot topic at in multiple government levels at the moment. So there's the public sector definition of co-design. Communities that I work with, they have their own definitions of co-design. So for me, as an Aboriginal person and an Aboriginal business owner, my principles of co-design are about how do we authentically include stakeholders in the design of policies and programs that will affect and ultimately benefit them. I'm very fortunate to be in the position where the work that I do, a lot of it draws on my co-design principles. And look, Maddie, I grew up in a country town, so the reason I'm saying that is because communication goes a long way. When I do this work around co-design, I'm doing it without really thinking, and it's about good communication. It's about having good conversations, engaging others, being respectful, and from there, things tend to build upon each other. So a conversation might lead to an outcome where from there's an ability to influence and negotiate the development of a policy or program. So it's certainly an exciting space to be in, and something that I genuinely enjoy. Yeah,
so if we take a step back for a moment, right, because I'm sure there's people listening right now and they hear this term co-design. It sounds like a fancy word, but what does actually co-design mean?
Look, for me, if I strip away the fancy terminology and the hype and the buzz about it, it's about how I can work with people and then we mutually collaborate on something. And through there's some pretty clear principles and boundaries that I adhere to, and that includes listening and genuinely listening, not just hearing, but listening and processing what the other party is saying. So that's a huge thing for me. Listening and then contributing to conversations, Matthew, that you do so in a positive manner. So it's easy to hear what's going on, but what I really enjoy doing is seeing people come together, and when the conversation is progressive and constructive, the outcomes are, quite tangible, they're beneficial. And from there, it almost creates this collective harmony with the group. So it's relationship building, it's a bit of capacity development, and it's empowering. Look, this sounds a bit wishy-washy, but it's almost magical in a sense, where it's not just somebody making a decision and then implementing that decision with a target group of people. It's like, look, what do you want to see in this space? How can we achieve it? And then you have the honest conversation in a respectful manner about what has worked, what hasn't worked. And then moving forward, how do we make sure we're not replicating like things that have happened in the past, so that we're moving forward progressively?
Yeah, and I love the way that you spoke about listening as part of co-design before as well. I feel like listening is a massive pathway to achieving the solution, because people can speak and scream and yell, but if nobody's listening, then the change won't happen. And I feel like as people, as organisations, boards, communities, when we listen to the message that's being said, that's when we can connect and really achieve these kinds of outcomes, right?
Yeah, absolutely right, Matthew. And I think the listening thing is particularly important for me because, you and I, we're both Aboriginal people in our communities, and we have relationships with all levels of community, right? And what I find really insightful for myself is when I speak to elders and people that have been around for a while, and they'll talk about things that have happened in the past and how they were consulted or engaged with. And so for example, if there's a new policy or initiative development, and whoever's designing it or developing it will go to an Aboriginal community and meet with people and facilitate a workshop and then take something away. And then the feedback that I've heard consistently is Aboriginal people are quite often not heard in that space, or listened to. So yes, they might be contributing to that workshop, but then what culminates out of that is almost like a replication of something that has happened years ago that has been proven not to work. So for me, I am very committed to listening to the people that I work with, and regardless of the piece of work that I'm working on, I just try to make sure that their voices are captured and heard as authentically and impactful as possible. Yeah,
it's interesting when you speak this, because something that I've realised that is really impactful when delivering workshops is providing the space for mob and also non-Aboriginal people to be able to voice, connect, come together. And often as the facilitator of a workshop, the main role then being about channeling the conversations into the right direction. And sure, when facilitating, you do need to speak. You do need to do your role and share knowledge and information, help educate and empower people that are in that workshop. I think that there's quite a few workshop facilitators out there that speak way more than necessary and don't listen enough. And you can easily see how speaking too much and not listening enough can have some really devastating consequences, right? And do you think that it's the intention in which the listening takes place that is also really important as part of co-design?
Look, good question, Matthew. I think there's two aspects to that. I think, first of all, the earlier reference that you made about the different styles of facilitation, there's certainly, in my opinion, a line that can be crossed where facilitators can dominate conversations and speak too much. For me, the safety is incredibly important. A lot of my workshops, I say that up front, right at the start. Sometimes, and Matt, I'm sure you've seen this too with your work, sometimes workshops can cruise really well. Like you have a group of people that are collectively collaborative and working towards a similar goal. So the workshop is like a thing of beauty to be involved with, because you watch the conversations take place and you watch people's interest and people's confidence grow when they contribute to the conversation. It's phenomenal. And then look, sometimes it doesn't always go so well. And I think when you facilitate, you're put in that position where you have to make a call pretty quickly as to how you respond when things do go a bit sideways. And you certainly don't want to alienate anyone or exasperate the issue or concern or the personality if that's the case. But fundamentally, there's an element of respect that as a facilitator, we have to adopt. And I think we should be adopting. So whether it's actually listening to the conversations, not dominating the conversation, and then if something does go a bit sideways, how do you respectfully manage that without blowing it up and it turning into a huge challenge, huge issue? So I think, when you're in a situation like that, if you're presenting as respectful, and I think authenticity, and look, I'm also a little bit mindful. I feel like the term authenticity has been overused in recent years and maybe not used in the most transparent of ways. So I'm a little bit mindful of that term, but I truly believe that in that space, being respectful, being authentic, and look, respectful and listening, I think it shines through. People see that, and whether it's you in that space or me running a workshop, they might say, Matthew, we can tell he's not here running his own game or an agenda, and he's actually valuing us as people and Aboriginal individuals. I think that goes a long way. I really think it does.
Yeah, that's related to the intention piece as well, right? If we want to achieve outcomes, if we want to negotiate positive outcomes with others, the intention behind those communications can really determine the meaning of the words that we're using. And also our intention in the way that we listen. So we can hear the same thing from the same person. If we have a negative connotation in our mind as they speak, we're not going to take the words they're saying necessarily in the right way. And so it's also about being open and focused on the greater good as well.
Maddie, I think that openness too, there's a level of honesty and transparency and accountability that fits within that, because as facilitators, we may be tasked with an objective, right? If we're running a workshop for the goal of something, whether it's co-designing a policy or seeking feedback from the community about an initiative or whatever it may be, I think, the people that we're working with on the other side of the coin, whether it's a public sector agency or a corporation, I think there's also a level of respect that should be in that side of the relationship where we're not doing something to tick a box or to do it to validate, I guess, the other side's engagement, practice or methodology or justification. It's like, look, if you genuinely want to do this, and I'm using co-design as an example, but if you want to genuinely co-design something, it's important to hear from the people that it's going to impact about what works, what doesn't work, but then also having the time and the space to really think about designing something that is going to be progressive moving forward. It's not a rush job to get it out quickly, to meet like an announceable or anything like that. It's like, if you want to do this type of work properly, there has to be that space and time to really consider and process and think about how this is going to look. So.
And have you ever been involved in a negotiation that has involved government and you're representing community interests that's come across a particular curveball? And what happened?
I try to really represent without overstepping the people, like the community and the people that I'm working with. So to be respectful and transparent, to conduct myself with integrity, and ultimately to truly represent, if I'm working with a community and advocating for something, what does the community need out of it? And, what's going to benefit them long term? And so, look, as an example, I do a lot of work with ACOs and communities, and I genuinely enjoy it. Like, for me, I feel like I've found my place in the world with that type of work. I really like it. And so one of the ACOs, I was talking to their board, and they were having some issues with service provision in that community, and the service provision was coming from a public sector agency. But my lens when I approached it was, how can these things be optimised and more efficient, and so that like the wastage was really minimised if there was any wastage, but that was part of my work, was to scope out where the gaps were and how could this be improved so that all parties would benefit. And so for me, I was in this position where, I as a former public servant myself, I have a little bit of an understanding of how the mechanisms of government operate. So I was able to bring that knowledge into those conversations. I was able to facilitate a good outcome with that community, but that was heavily influenced, Matthew, by senior leadership within that agency. One, they had been in the agency for a long time, and they were very people focused and service focused. So the leadership were, okay, look, Marius, we know that this isn't working well. What can we do differently? So what I'm saying is that collaboration and cooperation from that public sector agency. They really listened to what the community, the board of directors of that community were saying. And so from there, we were able to tweak some aspects of service delivery so that things were more efficient, and moving forward, the relationships between the two really grew and really strengthened. So for me, that was the beauty. I was able to take a step back because now the board of directors and that service agency were working really well together. And so for me, that's one of my goals, Matthew, is to kind of work myself out of that job, because whatever I'm doing, I want to make sure that both parties are empowered to continue moving forward, because I don't see myself as being there long term. So it's like, look, if I can help get you back on track and get you to a place where you're all benefiting it, then awesome.
Yeah, because when we're negotiating, we need to understand that we go in with a particular role to be fulfilled, and we need to see the outcome of that role and move on from that place into another negotiation, into another context, into another role. Sometimes there are people who can get themselves involved in a negotiation, particularly when it can be involving community. They become very passionate about it. They become almost like addicted to the problem, and they become so entrenched in the problem that they can never move past it. And so what we need to be able to do is keep our mind on the solution. And it sounds like you did this really well when working between this government agency and the Aboriginal corporation and its board, because it sounds like you stepped in at a time where they weren't communicating or properly hearing each other. You were able to step in there to help to develop that relationship, and then you were able to move on at a time when those communication channels had been established. And the great thing there is community, in which government body and also the board need to be serving that community benefits as a result of that clear communication. So it sounds like a really good job took place there.
It was a great outcome, and that took place over a series of months too. It wasn't just a quick come in and facilitate some conversations and rebuild relationships, in 1 or 2 weeks. That took some time to, achieve. But I think, Matthew, what you said about passion, that featured in that piece of work as well, because for me, I was able to draw on the passion from the board of directors and the community and use that to really highlight the urgency of, getting this service delivery back on track and where it needed to be, because it wasn't just affecting that, 1 or 2 individuals, it was affecting the broader community. And so what I found was drawing on the passion of the community and then articulating it in a way that, can speak the bureaucratic jargon and all that, the government language. So just translating it into a language that resonated with the public sector agency. And then they were like, okay, look, now we understand it a little bit clearer. So yeah, I think passion has a time and place in those conversations. And, sometimes the willingness of the other party to negotiate is also a huge factor, because I'm sure you've seen it too, where sometimes some of these negotiations, the other party are just, they've drawn a hard line as to what they will give up or flex to or whatever it may be. But I don't have all the answers, unfortunately. There's some conversations now that I walk in and it's a hard negotiation. The other party are just unwilling to compromise or bend or give up ground or whatever terminology they like to use. But I think they see it as a, bit of a loss as to, oh, look, if I give up this, then I've lost it. And it's like, no, it's not necessarily about that. It's about how can we work together better so that other people benefit, but also we build stronger relationships in that process. So,
do you have any particular strategies that you like to use if you step into an environment where the other party doesn't want to negotiate or they're not being very open and receptive? What sort of strategies do you use to try and get the ball rolling?
I like to tease out the conversation and explore, I guess, any grey areas from my end. And for me, that also helps me to identify how willing they are to negotiate. The beauty of having a conversation with someone that's willing to negotiate it's fantastic, right? Because I feel like they have a space to bring their concerns to the table and I have a space to bring mine. And from there, we just kind of mould it around and build on something that suits both of our needs. But, in the more unpleasant conversations where the other party is absolutely unwilling, I think it's important to understand that might not be the day to have that conversation. Maybe it's important to park it and revisit it at a later date when, maybe the other party is unwilling, maybe I'm not, the best version of myself to have that conversation. So I think looking at having at a different day at a time is an option. So for me, once I understand that, they're keen to negotiate, or they're open to it at least, awesome. But if they're just a staunch no, for me, I'm taking stock in the back of my head as to, all right, well, what's my next strategy now? What's my next action after this? If this party is unwilling to be a part of this, what are my other options? Can I work around it? Is there an alternative elsewhere? Is there somebody else that I can talk to that, is probably a bit more open to negotiation on this particular piece of work or with this community? I think taking stock and reading the room is, as early as possible, is incredibly important to understanding how much you can realistically achieve.
Timing can definitely be a factor, but we don't want to procrastinate because that can also make matters worse. Mm-hmm. So where's the mid ground? And I'm thinking about this when we talk about negotiating when somebody doesn't want to negotiate. Do we leave it or do we press it? We have a go at negotiating in those situations. If we're not feeling at our peak, then perhaps we press it but not to the nth degree. Or if that person isn't at their peak, we perhaps don't press them to the nth degree. I think that we also don't want to just chuck it in a too hard basket and leave it, because normally those sorts of situations are where there's some sensitive issues involved. But those sensitivities can grow in magnitude and become worse in terms of the harm that's being caused to community. So I think that we do want to always try to negotiate on points where we can, and try and get a level of reception with the other side, even if they're not prepared to negotiate with us. I also think that sometimes it's about leverage. If the other party's holding all the cards in their hands, they're calling all the shots, well then perhaps if they've got it going the way they want it to be happening and they're controlling everything, it's the way really they want it to be, then where's the leverage? Where do they have skin in the game to negotiate with you? And I think sometimes in those situations, it's about clearly understanding the interests and finding that point of their interest that you can really tackle them on.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's about shaking the tree and seeing where the apples fall. Sometimes you need to shake things up to create some space for movement to happen, making sure there's that leverage to achieve those kinds of negotiation outcomes. But I think that as a general rule of thumb, if we can be sure to aim at stepping forwards on those matters that are really important to community, what we're working on. Yeah, let's have a crack at negotiating on those points and not letting the other party push us away if we feel like that's something that's really important to be negotiating on.
Yeah, I agree, Matty, and I think like everything you said just resonates. And I think the other aspect of this too is that understanding too the environment of which you may have an ability to negotiate. So, and I say this because with some conversations that are maybe bound by legislation or some legal implications, that sort of thing, I think it's important, legal requirements and compliance is another thing too. So knowing, having an understanding of that environment and then working to achieve some sort of outcome that, the other party, you take into account what they're saying and like what you're trying to achieve and where can you hopefully meet in the middle. And some of those compliance conversations, Matty, I find can be like very structured, right? And sometimes a little bit trickier to negotiate an optimal outcome, but it's certainly not impossible. It's a learning journey for myself, and I look around at who I think are some really strong negotiators, such as yourself. And I know you and I, we talk regularly about our approaches to negotiation and that sort of thing. And I really draw from what my peers and colleagues, are doing across the board. And I know that the learning journey, I'm still in its infancy, right? So I'm constantly trying to learn about this type of thing. But what I, make sure I do is, am I representing the people, my communities and my clients and whatnot to the best of my ability? That's really that thing that is in the back of my head in every conversation, especially if it's an ACO or an Aboriginal business and I'm having a conversation with a government authority or whoever it may be. And it's like, look, at the end of the day, I want to get an optimal outcome for that ACO or that Aboriginal business. That's the thing that I really, really want to achieve. So, and I do that because if I have a platform to help and support them and lend whatever experience, or skills I have to their capacity and empowerment and whatnot, that's what drives me. So,
yeah, awesome. I think that your heart, your spirit, your desire to see great outcomes for Aboriginal communities, and also bridging that pathway of communication between communities, with government, with corporates, and seeing the greater good is absolutely remarkable. And so keep on doing this amazing work you're doing, Marius. We're about to wrap up this episode, but there's something that I want to hear your thoughts on. And this last final point, it's a little bit left of field based on what we've been speaking about. But for all listeners tuning in with us right now, I think this is going to be a really relevant point. And so it'd be great to hear your views on this one. So in your business, when you're setting price points and you're negotiating those price points, how do you find the particular place to set a price? And how do you go about negotiating on that price?
Well, I think so first of all, I've been, my consultancy has been operating for 6 years now. So I've had to really reassess my price point several times throughout this journey. And that's based on, I guess, what's happening in the marketplace, but also my ability to deliver what I think and based on my clients is like high quality pieces of work. So it's about striving that balance of value, but also not cutting myself out of work. I'm currently working with a number of Aboriginal businesses from the circle around their business and strategic planning, and I'm very sort of adamant in those activities where I'm like, look, set your price point and try to stick to it as best as you can. There's if there's scope to flex, to if you think that you've got a good chance of winning a job, then by all means consider it, but don't be willing to underestimate your value as an individual and a business of what you're bringing into this space. So there's certainly a lot of competition in the Aboriginal business environment here in South Australia at the moment, but I genuinely don't want to see mob being played off against each other. And I feel like, if you look at the consultancy space as well, I mean, it's quite dynamic. There's a lot of consultants at the moment, which I think is positive for the market, right? I mean, 10 years ago, Aboriginal consultants were a little bit more, there were limited options, but now, I mean, there's much more, which I think is good for, options for different pieces of works. And look, I think that, and I experienced this myself very recently actually, where my prices were queried, and when I talked about the value that I could bring to the project, I was able to demonstrate some similar projects where I've delivered similar pieces of work at different price points, and then the entity that I was speaking to, once they saw what I had done at different price points, and then that seemed to settle them a bit, and they said, okay, look, Marius, we've seen what you're able to deliver now, so this makes a bit more sense. But my thoughts are that businesses, especially Aboriginal businesses, where there's such a nuanced blend of culture and business acumen, I really don't want to see them undervalue, undersell themselves, or feel like they have to cheapen themselves up to be competitive. I think it's a bit of a travesty if things continue down that space, and I'd like to see more support from whether it's government agencies, especially in the procurement space, around reinforcing those values with Aboriginal businesses, because the reality is there's a lot of opportunity in this space at the moment, and it is highly competitive, but at the same time I think mob should understand what they're bringing to the table and not let themselves think, oh, maybe I need to revise my costings, or it's like, no, you empower yourselves. Like you're bringing something really nuanced to the table, especially if you've got cultural insights that add value to projects beyond the project scope. I think incredibly valuable skills.
So you're speaking about self-determination here, self-determination in the collaboration between Aboriginal businesses and Aboriginal consultants alike. Also self-determination in understanding the empowerment and the value and the real worth that culture brings into the delivery, and also self-determination in not selling yourself short, but standing strong, knowing what you're worth and getting what you're worth because of the excellence in work that you're delivering.
Yeah, exactly what you said, Matty. You've captured it very well. And I think that when I think about myself, I look at our culture, right? We're the oldest living continuing culture in the world, and what we're bringing to our own business space is so unique. And it's like, a lot of our mob go above and beyond what they're expected to do and what they're offering. And I think naturally our mob have a streak of being educators, right? So sharing our culture and knowledge for the benefit of others, but at the same time, I want to make sure mob are recognised and valued for that too. So, and when people come to me and say, "Hey, Marius, look, this is what's happened. Like, what should I do?" And ultimately, I'll look at it objectively and break down the costs, and we'll do a bit of a market analysis, right? We'll try and see what others, especially non-Aboriginal people, may be offering in that space. In your case, if it was other legal representatives, but I think finding the balance between market competitiveness and also valuing what an Aboriginal business and person is offering in terms of the cultural knowledge, that additional value, is really important.
Brother, you've shared incredible wisdom with us today. Your knowledge, both culturally and also to be able to see things the way the government does, to bridge that gap. Also to be able to work with other Aboriginal businesses like you are through the circle and bring that strong sense of self-determination into the Aboriginal business landscape is absolutely amazing. It's powerful. Like I said, it's remarkable. And thanks for sharing some of the way you work and what you do, because I think that listeners can apply these principles you've been speaking of and have better co-design outcomes, achieve a stronger standing in that knowledge and place of self-determination, and really set the pathway for a better future for Aboriginal businesses, Aboriginal community, and really those impacts into the lives and communities for all Australians, I think is powerful stuff. So thanks for sharing. Thanks for being part of Rolling Through Negotiations podcast, Marius.
Thank you, Matty. Thank you, listeners, for the time today.
I trust you guys have enjoyed this episode. Remember, brand new episode of Rolling Through Negotiations podcast comes out each and every single Thursday. Us.